Mason Calloway had survived 3 tours in Iraq, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The 34-year-old veteran sat shirtless in Dr. Sarah Chen's small clinic, watching her face turn pale as she examined what should have been a simple rash on his back. What she found beneath his skin made her hands shake. Hard black objects were embedded in his flesh, arranged in a perfect spiral pattern. They weren't random growths or shrapnel from the war. These nodules had been placed there deliberately, like some kind of twisted message carved into his body. The X-rays showed them buried deep in his muscle, waiting. Mason stared at the images, his heart pounding as one terrifying question echoed. In his mind, what were they, and how long had they been there? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The morning had started like any other in Mason Calloway's carefully ordered life. His alarm went off at 0530, hours old habits from the army. Died hard, and he'd followed his routine with military precision. Coffee black, 2 eggs over easy, white toast. Check the weather, scan the local news. Feed his German Shepherd, Rex, by 0700. He was at Murphy's garage, sliding under the hood of Mrs. Patterson's old Buick, his hands already stained with grease and motor oil. Mason had been working at the garage for 3 years now, ever since he'd returned from his final deployment in Iraq. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it kept his hands busy. The owner, Tom Murphy, was a Vietnam vet himself, who understood that some conversations were better left unspoken. When Mason had nightmares that made him pace the shop floor at dawn, Tom simply handed him another cup of coffee and pointed to the work orders. The small town of Millbrook, Virginia, had welcomed Mason with the kind of quiet acceptance that rural communities reserve for their returning soldiers. People nodded respectfully when they saw him at the diner or the hardware store, that they didn't pry. They understood that war changed a man, and they gave him the space to find his footing again. It was in the sanctuary of routine and respectful distance that Mason had built his new life. His small apartment above the barber shop was sparse but clean, bed made with hospital corners, few possessions, everything in its place. The walls were bare except for a single photograph, his army unit from his second tour. 12 young men squinting in the desert sun. Half of them hadn't made it home. Sarah Mitchell had been the first person in Millbrook to break through Mason's carefully constructed walls. She was a nurse at the county hospital, 10 years younger than Mason, with kind eyes and a laugh that reminded him of his sister before the war had claimed her too. Sarah had approached him at the 4th of July barbecue last year, not with the careful reverence most people showed veterans, but with genuine curiosity about the man beneath the uniform. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on Sunday. Morning hikes through the Blue Ridge Mountains and quiet evenings watching old movies on her couch. Sarah never pushed him to talk about Iraq, but she listened when the memories surfaced unbidden. She'd learned to recognize the signs when the past pressed too close, the way his jaw tightened, how his eyes would fix on some distant point only. He could see it was Sarah who had first noticed the rash. "That looks angry," she'd said 3 weeks ago, running her finger along the inflamed skin on his shoulder blade. Mason had shrugged it off. Just another reminder of the desert, he'd thought. Sand fleas, chemical exposure, stress manifesting in physical symptoms. The VA doctors had warned him about such things, but the rash had spread, forming an odd pattern that Sarah's medical training couldn't explain. The raised welts seemed to follow some internal logic, creating lines and curves that hurt to look at. When over-the-counter treatments failed and the itching became unbearable, Sarah had insisted he see Dr. Chen. Dr. Sarah Chen had arrived in Millbrook 5 years earlier, fresh from her residency at Johns Hopkins. The town had been skeptical at first. What did a big city doctor want with their small community? But Dr. Chen had proven herself with gentle competence and genuine care. She remembered her patients' children's names, asked about their gardens, and never made anyone feel rushed or dismissed. Mason had trusted her immediately. There was something in her calm professionalism that reminded him of the good officers he'd served under, people who took responsibility seriously and didn't panic when things went sideways, which made her reaction to his x-rays all the more disturbing. "Mr. Calloway," Dr. Chen had said, her voice carefully controlled, "I need to ask you some questions about your military service." Mason's military records told a story of exemplary service and quiet heroism. 3 tours in Iraq between 2008 and 2014, serving with the 82nd Airborne Division. Commendations for valor, Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds sustained during an IED attack in Fallujah. Leadership positions, respect from his men, consistent performance under pressure. But there were gaps in the record periods marked only as classified operations or special assignment. Standard practice for certain types of missions, Dr. Chen understood, but the timing of these gaps was troubling. They clustered around 2010 and 2012, periods when Mason's medical records also showed unexplained illnesses and prolonged leaves. During these classified periods, Dr. Chen asked gently, "Do you recall any medical procedures? Vaccinations beyond the standard military requirements? Any experimental treatments?" Mason's face had darkened. The question touched something raw, memories he'd worked hard to bury. There had been needles, yes, lots of them. The Army had a vaccine for everything. It seemed anthrax, smallpox, things with names he couldn't pronounce. They told him it was necessary for his assignments, protection against biological weapons that insurgents might use. But some of those injections had been different. Administered in sterile rooms by doctors who wouldn't meet his eyes, followed by periods of observation and strange dreams. Mason had assumed it was part of the enhanced interrogation resistance training his unit had undergone. The military did all sorts of psychological conditioning, sleep deprivation, stress inoculation, building mental resilience. There were medical protocols, Mason admitted slowly. Part of our preparation for certain operations. I signed a lot of forms, agreed to experimental treatments. We all did. It was supposed to give us advantages in hostile environments. Dr. Chen had nodded, making notes in his file. She'd seen similar patterns in other veterans, men and women who'd been part of programs they couldn't fully discuss, who carried physical and psychological scars from treatments they barely understood. But Mason's x-rays showed something she'd never encountered before. The black nodules weren't random. They formed a precise spiral pattern, each object perfectly placed in relation to the others. The arrangement was too deliberate to be natural, too complex to be accidental. Under magnification, the objects appeared to have an organic texture, almost coral-like, but with geometric precision that suggested artificial construction. "Mr. Calloway," she'd said carefully, "I'm going to refer you to a specialist. Someone with experience in unusual cases related to military service. In the meantime, I want you to monitor any changes, new symptoms, alterations in the pattern, anything unusual." Mason had left the clinic with a prescription for antibiotics he knew wouldn't work and a referral to a doctor 3 hours away in Richmond. But more unsettling than the mysterious diagnosis was the look in Dr. Chen's eyes, a mixture of concern and something that looked almost like fear. That evening, Mason had called his grandfather for the first time in 6 months. Harold Calloway was 87 years old and living in the Shenandoah Valley Assisted Living Facility, his mind increasingly claimed by dementia. Mason's visits had become sporadic and painful, watching the sharp old soldier fade into confusion and repetition. Broke something in Mason's chest that he couldn't quite heal. Harold had served in Korea, though he'd never talked much about it. Like many men of his generation, the war was a closed chapter, filed away with other difficult memories. Mason knew his grandfather had been wounded, had spent time in military hospitals, but the details were locked behind decades of practice. Silence. "Grandpa, it's Mason," he'd said into the phone, hearing the familiar sounds of the facility in the background televisions. Conversations, the gentle chaos of communal living. "Mason?" Harold's voice was thin but alert. "My boy, how are you? It's been too long." "I'm fine, Grandpa. I wanted to ask you something. About your service in Korea. Did they ever do medical experiments? Unusual treatments or procedures?" There had been a long silence on the other end of the line. When Harold spoke again, his voice was different, sharper, more focused. "Why are you asking about that, son?" "I've been having some medical issues. The doctors think it might be related to my military service. I thought maybe you'd encountered something similar." Another pause, longer this time. Mason could hear his grandfather's labored breathing, the sound of someone wrestling with memories that had been buried for good reason. "There were programs," Harold said finally. "Things they didn't explain properly. They told us it was for our own protection, to make us better soldiers. We trusted them because we were young and stupid and proud to serve." "What kind of programs?" "I can't," Harold's voice cracked. "Mason, there are things I've spent my whole life trying to forget. Things I was told never to discuss. Grandpa, I need to know. Something's happening to me, and I think it might be connected." "Come see me," Harold said, his voice barely a whisper. "Come see me soon. There are things I need to tell you before it's too late." The line went dead, leaving Mason staring at his phone in the growing darkness of his apartment. Outside, the familiar sounds of Millbrook's evening routine continued. Cars heading home from work, dogs barking, children called in for dinner. But inside Mason's small sanctuary, something fundamental had shifted. He walked to his bathroom and twisted to examine his reflection in the mirror. The spiral pattern on his back seemed more pronounced in the dim light, the raised flesh casting small shadows that made the design look almost alive. As he watched, one of the nodules seemed to pulse, just slightly, like a heartbeat beneath. His skin-dot Mason turned away from the mirror and reached for his phone. He needed to call Sarah, needed to hear her voice and the steady rationality that had anchored him these past months. But his finger hesitated over her number. How do you tell someone you love that your body might be harboring something that defied explanation? How do you explain that your grandfather's cryptic warnings had awakened fears you couldn't name? Instead, Mason found himself pulling out his laptop and opening a web browser. If Dr. Chen's referral to a specialist was going to take weeks to arrange, he could at least start his own research. The military had taught him the value of intelligence gathering, of understanding your enemy before you engaged. But as he stared at the empty search bar, Mason realized he didn't even know what questions to ask. What do you call objects embedded in your flesh that seem to have been placed there deliberately? What do you call the growing certainty that your own body has become a battlefield in a war you never knew you were fighting? The cursor blinked, steadily, waiting for input. While outside Mason's window, the quiet town of Millbrook settled into another peaceful night. But inside the small apartment above the barbershop, a veteran of 3 combat tours found himself facing an enemy more mysterious and terrifying than anything he'd encountered in the desert. And somewhere in an assisted living facility, 30 miles away, an old Korean War veteran sat by his window, staring out at the darkness and remembering things he promised never to remember again. The Shenandoah Valley Assisted Living Facility smelled of disinfectant and cafeteria food, with undertones of old age and resignation that Mason had learned to brace himself against. He'd made the drive early Saturday morning, his grandfather's urgent tone from their phone conversation still echoing in his mind. Mason found Harold in the common room, hunched over a small table by the window. The old man's hands moved frantically across a piece of paper, sketching something with the intensity of a man possessed. Other residents gave him a wide berth, even in this place where strange behavior was commonplace. Harold's manic drawing had unsettled the staff. "Grandpa?" Mason approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. Harold looked up, his eyes sharp and focused in a way Mason hadn't seen in months. The dementia that usually clouded his grandfather's features seemed to have lifted, replaced by an alertness that was almost frightening. "Mason, you came." Harold's voice was strong, urgent. "Look at this. Tell me if you recognize it." Mason looked down at the paper and felt his blood turn to ice. Harold had drawn a perfect spiral, identical to the pattern of nodules on Mason's back. The old man's shaking hands had somehow produced a precise geometric design, each curve and line matching what Mason had seen in his X-rays. "How did you?" Mason began, but Harold was already reaching for another sheet of paper. "I've been drawing them for weeks," Harold said, his pencil moving with practiced efficiency. "Started the day after you called about medical experiments. They just came to me, like muscle memory, like something I'd done 1,000 times before." Mason watched in horrified fascination as his grandfather produced spiral after spiral, each one slightly different but following the same basic pattern. Some were simple curves, others complex geometric designs that hurt to look at. All of them seemed familiar in a way that made Mason's skin crawl. "Grandpa, what are these?" Harold stopped drawing and looked directly at Mason. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that took Mason back to childhood, when his grandfather had been the strongest, smartest man in the world. "They're maps, son. Biological maps. And if you're here asking about them, it means they're starting to work." A nurse approached their table, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to dealing with confused elderly residents. "Mr. Calloway, your grandfather has been quite agitated lately," she said to Mason in a low voice. "He's been asking for these art supplies constantly, drawing the same patterns over and over. The staff psychiatrist thinks it might be a form of obsessive behavior related to his condition." Harold's head snapped up. "I'm not crazy, Ruth, and I'm not confused. Not about this." "Of course not, Harold," the nurse said soothingly. "But perhaps you could take a break from drawing? Your grandson is here to visit." "The drawing is why he's here," Harold said firmly. Then, to Mason, "Tell her to leave us alone. We need privacy for this conversation." Mason looked between his grandfather and the nurse, seeing genuine concern in her expression. But there was something in Harold's manner, a clarity and purpose that suggested the old soldier was having one of his increasingly rare lucid moments. "Could we have a few minutes alone?" Mason asked. "I'd like to hear what he has to say." The nurse hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. I'll be at the desk if you need anything." When she was gone, Harold immediately pulled out a worn leather journal from beneath his chair. The cover was cracked with age, the binding held together with rubber bands. With trembling hands, he opened it to reveal pages covered with the same spiral patterns interspersed with handwritten notes in Korean and English. "I started keeping this in 1953, Harold said. After they let me out of the hospital. The doctors told me I'd been wounded in action, that I'd suffered head trauma that caused memory problems. But I remembered things they said I shouldn't remember. Places I'd never been, procedures I'd never agreed to." Mason leaned closer, studying the journal's contents. The early entries were neat, methodical, the work of a disciplined mind trying to make sense of fragmented memories. But as the pages progressed, the handwriting became more erratic, the spiral patterns more complex and urgent. "What happened to you over there, Grandpa?" Harold's fingers traced one of the spirals absently. "I volunteered for a special program. They said it would help us fight better, survive longer, make us more effective soldiers." He laughed bitterly. "What they didn't tell us was that we were test subjects in something much bigger." Mason felt a chill of recognition. The experimental treatments during his own service, the injections and observations, suddenly they took on a more sinister cast. They called it Project Shepherd, Harold continued. The idea was to create enhanced soldiers using biological modifications. Not cybernetics or drugs, something deeper. Something that would be passed down through generations. Passed down? Mason's voice was barely a whisper. Harold looked up from the journal, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and fear. The modifications weren't just for us, Mason. They were designed to affect our children and our children's children. Each generation was supposed to be stronger, faster, more resilient. Perfect soldiers bred from within. Mason's hand unconsciously moved to his back, where the spiral pattern of nodules continued their mysterious work beneath his skin. You're saying this thing inside me came from you? Not just me, your father too, though he never knew it. The modifications lay dormant until triggered by specific conditions, stress. Certain chemicals, electromagnetic frequencies, the military, could activate entire bloodlines when they needed them. Harold flipped through more pages of the journal, showing Mason photographs that made his stomach lurch. Images of soldiers in hospital beds, their bodies marked with the same spiral patterns. Mason carried documents stamped with classified markings, signed by officials whose names had been blacked out. I kept everything I could steal or copy, Harold said. Evidence of what they did to us. But I was young and scared, and they made it clear that talking about the program would mean court-martial at best, disappearance at worst. Mason studied one of the photographs, a group of soldiers standing outside a military facility, their shirts off to reveal identical spiral patterns carved into their backs. His grandfather was among them, decades younger, but unmistakably the same man. Why are you telling me this now? Because they're activating again, Harold said urgently. The program went dormant after Korea, but something's changed. I can feel it, a pulling, a calling. The same feeling I had right before they first triggered the modifications in 1953. As if summoned by his words, Mason felt a strange sensation across his back, a warm tingling that spread outward from each nodule. He'd experienced similar feelings over the past few weeks, but had dismissed them as psychosomatic responses to stress. What's supposed to happen when they activate? Harold's expression darkened. We become what they designed us to be. Enhanced soldiers with capabilities beyond normal human limits. Faster reflexes, improved healing, heightened senses, perfect weapons for unconventional warfare. And if someone doesn't want to be activated, then they find ways to make you compliant, or they eliminate you as a security risk. The implications hit Mason like a physical blow. The mysterious illness, the strange patterns in his flesh, his grandfather's urgent warnings, they were all pieces of a puzzle that painted a terrifying picture of manipulation and control spanning generations. How many others are there? Dozens of families, maybe hundreds. Each bloodline carries the potential, waiting for activation. Most never know what they're carrying until it's too late. Harold pulled out a folded piece of paper from the back. Of the journal, a list of names and addresses, some crossed out, others marked with dates and brief notations. I've been tracking the families over the years, as much as I could. Some died in accidents that weren't accidents. Others simply disappeared. A few, like us, kept their heads down and hoped the program would stay buried. Mason scanned the list, recognizing some surnames from his military service fellow soldiers whose families might be carrying the same biological modifications without knowing it. Grandpa, what am I supposed to do with this information? Harold closed the journal and pressed it into Mason's hands. You're supposed to choose, son. The same choice I faced 70 years ago. Accept what they made you and serve their purposes. Or fight back and risk everything to break free. What did you choose? The old man was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the peaceful Virginia countryside. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with decades of regret. I chose to hide, to pretend the modifications weren't real, that the program had been just another military experiment gone wrong. I married your grandmother, raised your father, tried to live a normal life. But the modifications were always there, sleeping on our bloodline, waiting for someone to wake them up. And now they're waking up in me. Yes, and in others like you. The children and grandchildren of the original test subjects. They're calling in their investment, Mason, activating the sleepers for whatever war they're preparing to fight next. Mason felt the weight of the journal in his hands, decades of hidden truth, carefully documented evidence of a conspiracy that stretched across generations. But along with the revelation came a crushing sense of responsibility. How long do I have? The activation process takes time, weeks, maybe months. But once it starts, it's hard to stop. The biological modifications become integrated with your nervous system, your metabolism, your brain chemistry. After a certain point, trying to remove them would kill you. A new voice interrupted their conversation, young, concerned, familiar. Mason? What are you doing here? Mason turned to see Dr. Chen approaching from the facility's entrance, still wearing her white coat from the clinic. Her presence in this place, at this moment, struck him as more than coincidental. Dr. Chen? How did you? I called her. Harold said quietly. Last night, after you hung up. I told her you were coming, that she needed to be here for this conversation. Doctor. Chen pulled up a chair, her expression serious. Mr. Calloway, your grandfather contacted me because he believes his medical history is connected to your condition. He shared some very interesting information about experimental military programs. Mason looked between his grandfather and his doctor, suddenly aware that he was part of a conversation that had been orchestrated without his knowledge. What kind of information? Dr. Chen opened a folder she'd been carrying. Documentation of biological modifications performed on Korean War veterans, including detailed medical records and photographs that matched the pattern of nodules in your back. She spread several pages across the table, copies of Harold's journal entries, medical files from military hospitals, and most disturbing of all, recent X-rays that weren't Mason's but showed identical spiral patterns. You've seen this before, Mason said. It wasn't a question. 3 times in the past 6 months. All veterans, all carrying the same biological modifications, all experiencing similar symptoms to yours. Where are they now? Dr. Chen's expression darkened. 2 are missing. The 3rd died in what was ruled an accident, though the circumstances were suspicious. The weight of conspiracy and danger settled over their small group like a storm cloud. Mason realized that his quiet life in Millbrook, his carefully constructed peace, was about to be shattered by forces set in motion before he was born. What happens next? He asked. Harold reached across the table and gripped Mason's hand with surprising strength. That depends on you, son. Are you going to run and hide like I did? Or are you going to fight back against the people who turned our family into weapons? Mason looked down at the journal, at the decades of evidence and anguish it represented. Outside the facility's windows, the Virginia countryside stretched peacefully toward the mountains, the same landscape his family had called home for generations. But beneath that peaceful surface, something ancient and terrible was stirring. To life, I need to know more, Mason said finally. About the program, about the other affected families, about what's being planned for us. Double quotes. Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. Then we start by finding the others. The ones who are still alive, still fighting the activation. Because if your grandfather is right about the timeline, we don't have much time before the choice is taken away from all of us. Harold smiled for the first time since Mason had arrived, an expression that mixed pride with deep sadness. My boy is going to fight, he said softly. Finally, someone in this family is going to fight back. Mason spent the drive back to Millbrook in a state of controlled panic. Harold's journal sat on the passenger seat like a bomb waiting to explode, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of anxious handling. Every few miles, Mason found himself glancing at it, still unable to fully process the magnitude of what his grandfather had revealed. The biological modifications sleeping in his bloodline. Project Shepherd. The systematic transformation of American soldiers into something beyond human. It read like science fiction, but the evidence was undeniable, documented in medical files, photographed in clinical detail, and most convincingly, growing beneath his own skin. By the time Mason reached his apartment, the spiral pattern on his back was burning with a heat that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. He stripped off his shirt and examined himself in the bathroom mirror, watching as the raised nodules seemed to shift slightly beneath the inflamed skin. The phone rang, startling him from his examination. "Mason?" Sarah's voice carried a note of concern. "I stopped by the garage. Tom said you'd taken the day off to visit your grandfather. Is everything okay?" Mason stared at his reflection, seeing a man caught between two worlds. The peaceful civilian life he'd built in Millbrook and the militarized nightmare his family had been drafted into before he was born. "Can you come over? I need to tell you something important." "Of course. I'll be right there." While waiting for Sarah, Mason opened his laptop and began researching the names on Harold's list. Most led to obituaries, men and women who died in accidents, suicides, or unexplained illnesses over the past several decades. But a few names yielded more hopeful results. Thomas "Tommy" Brennan, grandson of Corporal James Brennan, Korean war veteran, currently living in Roanoke, working as an EMT. Recent social media posts mention mysterious health issues and frustration with VA doctors. Rita Valdez, daughter of Sergeant Maria Valdez, Army nurse in Korea, living in Norfolk. Employed as a high school principal. Her recent posts show concern about strange dreams and unexplained fatigue. Carl Morrison, son of Staff Sergeant Robert Morrison, infantry veteran, living in Richmond, working construction. His posts were sparse, but Mason found a recent entry in a veteran support forum asking about unusual medical symptoms following routine vaccinations. Each name represented a potential ally or a warning about his own future. Sarah arrived 20 minutes later, letting herself in with the key Mason had given her months earlier. She found him hunched over the laptop, Harold's journal open beside him, surrounded by printed pages and handwritten notes. "My God, Mason, you look terrible. What happened at the facility?" Mason gestured for her to sit down, then spent the next hour walking her through everything Harold had revealed. Sarah's medical training helped her process the technical aspects, the biological modifications, the genetic inheritance, the systematic nature of the program. But Mason could see the struggle in her eyes as she tried to reconcile the fantastic story with the evidence spread across his coffee table. "This is insane," she said finally. "You're talking about a conspiracy spanning 70 years, involving multiple government agencies and thousands of people." "I know how it sounds. Do you? Because what you're describing is the systematic genetic modification of American families without their knowledge or consent. The creation of sleeper agents programmed to activate on command. This isn't just conspiracy theory territory. Mason, this is science fiction." Mason turned his laptop screen toward her, showing her the forum posts he'd found, then explained these. 3 people with the exact same symptoms, all descendants of Korean War veterans, all experiencing activation within the same time frame. Sarah read through the posts, her skepticism warring with her medical training. The symptoms described were consistent, specific, and matched Mason's condition in disturbing detail. "Even if this is real," she said slowly, "what are you planning to do about it? Fight a secret government program with decades of resources and unlimited authority?" I'm planning to find the others first. Build a network of people who understand what's happening to them. Gather evidence. Then figure out how to fight back. And if you're wrong, if this is just some elaborate delusion brought on by PTSD or medication side effects. Mason pulled off his shirt and turned his back to her. The spiral pattern had become more pronounced since his visit with Harold. The nodules forming raised. Ridges that seemed to pulse with their own energy. Does this look like a delusion to you? Sarah examined the pattern with her trained medical eye, her fingers tracing the geometric precision of the arrangement. Under her touch, the nodules felt warm, almost alive. "This is impossible," she whispered. "These objects, they're integrated with your muscle tissue, your nervous system. Removing them surgically would cause massive trauma, possibly death. Which means I need to find another way to deal with them." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the evidence spread across Mason's apartment. When she spoke, her voice was resigned. "What do you need me to do?" Mason felt a rush of gratitude mixed with guilt. Involving Sarah meant putting her at risk, dragging her into a conspiracy that had already claimed multiple lives. But he also knew he couldn't face this alone. "Help me contact the others. Use your medical credentials to legitimize the outreach. People are more likely to trust a call from a doctor than from a random veteran with a crazy story." They spent the next 2 hours crafting careful messages to Tommy Brennan, Rita Valdez, and Carl Morrison. Sarah's medical training helped frame the outreach in clinical terms that wouldn't immediately trigger alarm or dismissal. The first response came from Tommy Brennan within an hour of Sarah's email. His reply was cautious but interested. He'd been experiencing similar symptoms and was desperate for answers that the VA couldn't provide. He agreed to a video call for the following evening. Rita Valdez took longer to respond, but when she did, her message carried an urgency that suggested she'd been waiting for someone to reach out. She was dealing with not only the physical symptoms but also disturbing dreams that seemed too vivid and specific to be random products of her subconscious. Carl Morrison's response was the most guarded. His background in construction had taught him to be suspicious of anything that sounded too good to be true. A Mason story definitely qualified. But he agreed to listen, with the caveat that he'd hang up at the first sign of anything that felt like a scam or trap. That evening, Mason and Sarah set up the first conference call of what would become an informal support network. The 4 participants: Mason from Millbrook, Tommy from Roanoke, Rita from Norfolk, and Carl from Richmond, represented different backgrounds and personalities, united by a shared nightmare. Tommy spoke first, his EMT training evident in his methodical description of symptoms. The spiral patterns had appeared on his back 3 months earlier, accompanied by increasingly vivid dreams and episodes of lost time. His girlfriend had noticed personality changes, increased aggression, hypervigilance, and almost compulsive need to train and maintain physical readiness. Rita's experience was similar, but included additional psychological symptoms. As an educator, she was accustomed to managing stress and maintaining emotional control. But the activation had brought episodes of rage and paranoia that threatened her career and relationships. Most disturbing were the dreams detailed scenarios of combat and covert operations that felt like memories rather than imagination. Carl's symptoms were more physical. The construction worker had always been strong, but the activation had brought capabilities that bordered on superhuman. He could work longer hours without fatigue, had developed almost perfect night vision, and found that minor injuries healed with startling speed. But these improvements came with a cost: chronic pain, insomnia, and a growing sense that his body was no longer entirely his own. So what do we do about it? Carl asked when everyone had shared their experiences. Assuming this Project Shepherd thing is real, how do we fight back against something this big? We start by documenting everything, Mason said. Symptoms, timelines, family histories. We need to understand the pattern, figure out how the activation works, and whether it can be stopped or reversed. What about going public? Rita suggested. Media exposure, congressional hearings, whistleblower protections? Tommy shook his head. I've seen what happens to whistleblowers in the medical field. They get discredited, sued into bankruptcy, or worse. And that's for exposing normal corruption. This is different. Different how? Because if Mason's grandfather is right, we're not just victims of this program, we're weapons. And weapons that reveal themselves to the enemy tend to get destroyed. The harsh reality of their situation settled over the group. They were fighting, not just for their own freedom, but for their survival in a conflict they never chose to join. There's something else, Mason said, sharing the most disturbing discovery from his research. I found records of similar symptoms in veterans from other conflicts. Not just Korea, but Vietnam, Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. Each generation carried forward the modifications, with improvements and refinements. You're saying this has been going on for 70 years? I'm saying Project Shepherd never ended. It evolved. Each war provided new test subjects, new opportunities to refine the biological modifications. We're not the first generation to be activated. We're just the latest. The implications were staggering. Thousands of families, multiple generations of soldiers, all carrying genetic modifications designed to turn them into enhanced warriors on command. And if the pattern held, their own children would inherit the same burden. What about treatment? Sarah asked, speaking for the first time since the call began. From a medical perspective, is there any way to reverse or neutralize the modifications? That's the million-dollar question, Tommy replied. And probably why the other affected veterans Dr. Chen mentioned ended up dead or disappeared. If there's a cure, someone doesn't want it found. The call ended with an agreement to meet in person the following weekend, somewhere neutral where they could examine each other's conditions and share documentation without electronic surveillance. Mason suggested a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains that belonged to Tom Murphy, isolated, defensible, and off the grid. After hanging up, Mason and Sarah sat in silence, processing the magnitude of what they'd undertaken. They were no longer dealing with a personal medical mystery, but with a conspiracy that spanned generations and potentially affected thousands of families. Are you sure about this? Sarah asked. Once we start down this path, there's no going. Back to your quiet life in Millbrook. Mason looked at Harold's journal, thinking about his grandfather's decades of silence and regret. He thought about the other veterans who'd been silenced or eliminated for asking too many questions. Most of all, he thought about the possibility that his own children, if he ever had any, might inherit the same burden of enforced service. No, he said finally. There's no going back. The activation has already started. Whether the first fight it or accept it, my quiet life in Millbrook is over. The only question now is whether I go down fighting or let them turn me into whatever they designed me to be. Sarah reached for his hand, her touch warm and reassuring in the growing darkness of his apartment. Then we fight, together. Outside, Millbrook settled into its peaceful evening routine, unaware that one of its residents had just declared war against forces that had been shaping American military policy for 7 decades. But in the small apartment above the barber shop, 2 people began planning for a battle that would determine not just their own fate, but the future of countless families caught in the crosshairs of Project Shepherd's legacy. The cabin sat in a hollow between 2 ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains, accessible only by a winding dirt road that Tom Murphy had warned would challenge any vehicle not built for rough terrain. Mason arrived first on Saturday morning, driving his pickup through early autumn mist that clung to the hollows like smoke. The isolation was perfect for their purposes. No cell towers, no internet, no electronic surveillance. Just dense forest, mountain streams, and the kind of profound quiet that made every sound seem amplified. Mason had brought camping supplies and enough food for the group. Uncertain how long their gathering would last, or what they might discover about each other. Tommy Brennan arrived an hour later in a battered Jeep that looked like it had seen action in several war zones. The EMT was younger than Mason had expected, maybe 28, with the lean build and alert posture of someone accustomed to emergency response. His handshake was firm, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings with professional wariness. "Hell of a place for a support group meeting," Tommy said, hefting his duffel bag from the Jeep. "But I guess conventional therapy wasn't going to cut it for our particular problems." They were setting up folding chairs on the cabin's covered porch when Rita Valdez arrived. The high school principal drove a sensible Honda that seemed almost comically out of place on the mountain roads, but she navigated the rough terrain with surprising skill. In her mid-40s, Rita projected an air of calm authority that Mason immediately respected, the kind of presence that could manage teenagers and school boards with equal effectiveness. "Gentlemen," she said, climbing out of her car and stretching, muscles cramped from the long drive, "I have to say, this is the most unusual professional development weekend I've ever attended." Carl Morrison was the last to arrive, his pickup truck modified with heavy-duty suspension and oversized tires that spoke to his construction background. The man himself was built like the equipment he operated, broad-shouldered, thick-handed, with the kind of physical presence that commanded respect on job sites. But Mason noticed the careful way Carl moved, as if he were constantly monitoring his own strength. "So," Carl said, accepting a cup of coffee from the pot Mason had started, "we're really doing this. 4 strangers meeting in the middle of nowhere, because we think the government turned our families into biological weapons." "When you put it like that, it does sound insane," Rita admitted. "But then again, so does the alternative explanation for what's happening to us." They spent the first hour sharing their stories in detail, comparing symptoms and timelines with the methodical approach of investigators building a case. Sarah had driven up separately and brought medical supplies, stethoscope, blood pressure, cuff, thermometer, and a digital camera for documenting their conditions. The similarities were striking and disturbing. All 4 had developed the spiral patterns within the past 6 months. All reported the same types of dreams and psychological changes, and all had family connections to Korean War veterans who'd served in specific units during 1952-1953. But the differences were equally revealing. Tommy's modifications seemed focused on enhanced reflexes and situational awareness skills that would benefit a combat medic or emergency responder. Rita showed increased mental acuity and pattern recognition abilities that enhanced her educational work but also made her hyper-aware of social dynamics and potential threats. Carl's enhancements were purely physical strength, endurance, and healing capabilities that exceeded normal human parameters. He demonstrated by lifting one end of the cabin's heavy wooden table with one hand, holding the position without apparent strain. Mason's modifications seemed more balanced, but also more invasive. His physical capabilities had improved, but not as dramatically as Carl's. His mental acuity was enhanced, but not to Rita's level. Instead, his changes seemed focused on leadership and tactical thinking, the kinds of skills that would make him effective at coordinating and commanding others. "It's like we're being shaped for different roles," Rita observed as Sarah documented their various capabilities. "Specialized functions within a larger operational framework. A team," Mason said, the realization hitting him with uncomfortable clarity. "They're not just creating enhanced individuals, they're building complete units with complementary skills." Tommy nodded grimly, "Which means there are probably others out there with different specializations. Communications, intelligence, technical support, everything you'd need for autonomous operations." The afternoon was spent examining Harold's journal and the documentation Mason had gathered. Rita's enhanced pattern recognition abilities, proved invaluable. She identified connections and correlations that the others had missed, building a more complete picture of Project Shepherd's scope and methodology. "Look at this," she said, spreading several pages across the cabin's dining table. "The timing isn't random. Each generation of activations corresponds with periods of international tension or military buildup. Korea in the 50s, Vietnam in the 60s, the Cold War arms race in the 80s. Carl studied the timeline she'd constructed. And now? Now we've got tensions with China, Russia, the Middle East, potential conflicts over resources and territory. Perfect conditions for activating sleeper assets." "But assets for what?" Tommy asked. "What kind of operations would require genetically enhanced soldiers operating on domestic soil?" The question hung in the air like a challenge none of them wanted to face. The implications were terrifying. American citizens modified and activated to conduct operations against their own country's enemies, or perhaps against their own countrymen. As evening approached, Sarah suggested they examine each other's modifications more carefully, using the cabin's oil lamps for illumination. She photographed and documented each person's spiral pattern, noting variations and measuring dimensions with scientific precision. "The patterns are definitely related," she concluded after reviewing the images. "Same basic design, but with individual variations that might correspond to your different specializations." Mason studied his own pattern in the photographs, seeing it with new clarity. The spiral wasn't just a biological antenna, as Harold had described. It was a complex interface, a biological circuit board that integrated with the nervous system to enhance and direct human capabilities. "What happens if we don't want these enhancements?" he asked. "Is there a way to remove them or shut them down?" Tommy's expression was grim. "I've been researching that question for months. From what I can find in medical journals and military documents, removing the modifications after integration would require major surgery with a high probability of death or permanent disability. And if we leave them alone, then we become what they designed us to be, enhanced soldiers under biological compulsion to serve whatever agenda activated us in the first place." Rita had been quiet during this exchange, staring into the darkness beyond the cabin's porch. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of difficult conclusions. "There's a third option we haven't discussed," she said. "What if we accept the modifications but reject their control? Use our enhancements for our own purposes instead of theirs? Is that even possible?" Carl asked. "I don't know, but I've been testing the limits of my capabilities, trying to understand how they work and whether I can direct them consciously. The results have been interesting." She demonstrated by closing her eyes and describing in detail the contents of each person's pockets, the number of insects crawling on the cabin's exterior walls, and the approximate distance and direction of the nearest highway. All information she couldn't possibly have gathered through normal senses. "The enhanced perception isn't just automatic," she explained. "I can focus it, direct it, even turn it on and off to some degree, which suggests the modifications respond to conscious control." This revelation sparked hours of experimentation, as each member of the group tested their abilities under controlled conditions. Tommy's enhanced reflexes could be consciously accelerated or dampened. Carl's strength could be precisely modulated rather than simply unleashed. Mason's tactical awareness could be focused on specific problems or expanded to encompass broader strategic considerations. By midnight, they had established that the biological modifications were not simply automatic enhancements, but sophisticated interfaces that responded to mental direction and conscious intent. "Which means," Mason said, as they prepared to settle in for the night, "that we might have more control over our situation than we initially thought." "Or," Carl countered, "we might just be discovering the extent to which we've been programmed. What feels like conscious control might actually be predetermined responses built into the system." It was a sobering thought that followed them into an uneasy sleep, made more disturbing by the shared dreams that began visiting all four of them around 3 a.m. in the dreams. They were together in a military facility, receiving briefings about missions they couldn't quite remember upon waking. There were other people in the dreams, enhanced individuals with different specializations, handlers who gave orders with absolute authority, and targets whose faces remained frustratingly unclear. Mason woke first, sweating despite the cool mountain air, his back burning with sensation from the spiral pattern. Around him, the others were stirring with similar signs of distress, all emerging from the same nightmare scenario. "Did you all?" he began. "Yeah," Tommy said grimly. "Same. Dream. Military briefing, mission parameters, teams of enhanced operatives." "It felt like a memory," Rita said, her voice shaken. "Like something I'd actually experienced." Carl was examining his hands in the dim light, flexing fingers that seemed stronger and more dexterous than they had been the evening before. "I think the dreams were training," he said quietly. "Practice scenarios for missions we haven't been assigned yet. The biological modifications aren't just enhancing our capabilities, they're programming us for specific operational roles." The realization that their own minds were being shaped and directed by the modifications added a new dimension of urgency to their situation. They weren't just dealing with physical changes, but with the systematic alteration of their consciousness and decision-making processes. "We need to find others," Mason said as dawn broke over the mountains. "Build a larger network, share information, figure out how widespread this activation really is. And we need to do it quickly," Rita added, "before the programming becomes too advanced to resist." They spent Sunday morning planning their next steps, establishing communication protocols and dividing research responsibilities. Tommy would investigate other EMT and medical personnel showing unusual capabilities. Rita would use her education contacts to identify teachers and administrators with enhanced analytical abilities. Carl would reach out through construction and blue-collar networks to find others with physical enhancements. Mason would coordinate their efforts while researching the historical scope of Project Shepherd and its current operational status. Sarah would provide medical support and help identify potential countermeasures or treatments as they prepared to leave the cabin. Each member of the group carried a new understanding of their situation. They were no longer just victims of a secret program, they were active participants in a conflict that had been building for generations. And their next moves would determine whether they became willing servants of Project Shepherd's agenda or leaders of a resistance movement that could expose and destroy the program forever. The drive back to civilization felt like crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Behind them lay the peaceful isolation of the mountains, where they had been able to pretend their situation was manageable and contained. Ahead lay a world where enhanced soldiers were being activated across the country, where government handlers waited to claim their biological assets, and where the wrong move could mean disappearance or death. But for the first time since his visit to Dr. Chen's clinic, Mason felt he wasn't facing the nightmare alone. Mason had been back in Millbrook for 3 days when Harold died. The call came from the assisted living facility at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the same nurse who had witnessed Mason's conversation with his grandfather. Harold had passed peacefully in his sleep, she explained, though the staff had noticed increased agitation in his final days, more frantic drawing, more urgent attempts to communicate with visitors who never came. Mason felt the loss like a physical blow, not just for the grandfather he'd finally begun to understand, but for the wealth of knowledge that had died with him. Harold had been the last direct link to Project Shepherd's origins, the final witness, who could have provided details about the program's implementation and the scientists who had designed it. The funeral was small, just Mason, Sarah, a few residents from the facility, and Tom Murphy representing the veteran community. As they lowered Harold's casket into the red Virginia soil, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they were burying more than just his grandfather. They were interring decades of secrets that might have held the key to breaking free from the program's control. But Harold's final gift to his grandson wasn't buried with his body. Mason discovered it 3 days later while cleaning out his grandfather's room, the facility. Hidden behind a loose baseboard, wrapped in oiled canvas and secured with tape that had yellowed with age, was a collection of documents that made Harold's journal look like casual note-taking. The centerpiece was a bound manual, its cover stamped with classifications so secret that Mason had never seen their designations during his own military service. Project Shepherd, Biological Enhancement Protocols, Transgenerational Implementation, read the title page, followed by signatures from officials, whose names had been carefully blacked out with permanent marker. Sarah helped him spread the documents across his apartment's dining table, both of them wearing latex gloves Sarah had borrowed from her clinic. Even decades old, the papers represented evidence of criminal conspiracy at the highest levels of government, the kind of material that could destroy careers, topple administrations, or get curious civilians killed in convenient accidents. The manual laid out Project Shepherd's methodology in clinical detail. Beginning in 1951, military researchers had developed a series of biological agents designed to enhance human performance through genetic modification. Unlike crude chemical enhancements or surgical implants, these agents worked at the cellular level, rewriting DNA to produce inherited improvements in strength, speed, mental acuity, and sensory perception. The genius of the program lay not in the immediate enhancement of active soldiers, but in the creation of enhanced bloodlines that could be activated generations later. Test subjects received modifications that remained dormant until triggered by specific biological signals, chemical compounds, electromagnetic frequencies, or even psychological conditioning that could be administered without the subject's knowledge. "Listen to this," Sarah said, reading from a section on activation protocols. "The biological modifications are designed to become fully integrated with the subject's nervous system over a period of 6 to 12 months. Once integration is complete, the enhanced individual becomes responsive to command frequencies, transmitted through standard military communication channels." Mason felt a chill of recognition. The burning sensation in his back, the vivid dreams, the compulsive need to seek out other enhanced individuals, all of it fit the pattern described in the manual. "What does it say about resistance?" he asked. "Is there a way to fight the programming?" Sarah flipped through several pages before finding the relevant section. Her expression grew increasingly troubled as she read. "Subjects who resist activation may experience severe psychological and physical symptoms, including hallucinations, violent behavior, and, in extreme cases, complete nervous system breakdown leading to death. And if they comply, enhanced individuals who accept their activation become ideal operatives for unconventional warfare scenarios. They retain their civilian identities and occupations while remaining responsive to tasking from designated handlers. Capabilities include, but are not limited to, enhanced physical performance, improved tactical thinking, accelerated healing, and the ability to operate effectively under extreme stress." Mason studied a diagram showing the biological interface between the spiral nodules and the human nervous system. The modifications weren't just enhancing existing capabilities. They were creating new neural pathways that could be controlled externally. "We're not just enhanced soldiers," he realized. "We're biological robots. Remote-controlled assets that can be activated and directed without our conscious awareness." The implications were staggering. Enhanced individuals could be living normal civilian lives while carrying out covert operations they wouldn't remember. Teachers, EMTs, construction workers, people in positions of trust and access throughout American society, all potentially serving as unknowing agents of whatever organization controlled Project Shepherd. Sarah continued reading, her voice growing more strained with each revelation. The program expanded significantly during the Cold War, with enhancement protocols refined and distributed to multiple military branches. By 1975, an estimated 12,000 American families carried the genetic modifications, with activation potential extending through at least 3 generations. 12,000 families? And that's just through 1975. The program appears to have continued well into the modern era. Mason did the math. If each family averaged 3 children per generation, and the modifications were passed down reliably, there could be hundreds of thousands of Americans carrying dormant enhancements. The scope of potential activation was mind-boggling. A loose sheet tucked into the back of the manual caught his attention. A handwritten note in Harold's shaky script. Elizabeth Kane, Bethesda, Maryland. She tried to stop them. She might still be alive. Sarah looked up from the documents. Whose? Elizabeth Kane? Mason was already opening his laptop. Let's find out. The search results painted a picture of a brilliant scientist whose career had been destroyed by ethical concerns. Dr. Elizabeth Kane, former researcher at the Army Biological Warfare Laboratories, had published several papers on genetic modification techniques in the early 1950s, before abruptly leaving government service in 1954. Later academic positions had been short-lived, and her research had shifted toward finding ways to reverse or neutralize biological modifications. She's still alive, Mason said, staring at a recent academic directory listing. 89 years old, living in a retirement community outside Washington, D.C. Do you think she'll talk to us? Only one way to find out. Mason's phone buzzed. With a text from Tommy Brennan. The MTIT have been investigating unusual cases among his colleagues and had found 3 other emergency responders showing signs of enhancement. More disturbing, all 3 had reported being approached by federal agents asking questions about their family histories and military connections. They're moving, Mason said, showing Sarah the message. Whatever timeline they're operating on, it's accelerating. Rita's report was equally alarming. She'd identified 5 teachers and administrators in her district with enhanced analytical abilities, but 2 had called in sick indefinitely after receiving visits from government personnel. Carl had found 6 construction workers with unusual physical capabilities, but 3 had disappeared entirely after talking to men claiming to be from worker safety organizations. They're collecting the activated ones, Sarah realized, bringing them in before they can organize or resist. Mason felt the familiar burning sensation spread across his back as his modifications responded to stress and elevated heart rate. The program wasn't just activating, it was mobilizing. Enhanced individuals were being identified, contacted, and either recruited or eliminated before they could become a threat to the project's security. We need to reach Dr. Kane immediately, he said. If she developed countermeasures or reversal techniques, we need that information before they shut down our network entirely. Sarah was already gathering the documents, handling them with the careful urgency of someone preserving evidence. What about the others? Tommy, Rita, Carl? We warn them. Give them the option to go underground or take their chances with official contact, but we can't wait for consensus. Every day we delay gives the handlers more time to track us down. Mason's laptop chimed with an incoming email from an address he didn't recognize. The sender was identified only as a friend, but the message made his blood run cold. Mr. Calloway, your grandfather's death was unfortunate but not unexpected. Enhanced individuals who fail to report for activation within the designated time frame experience rapid deterioration of their biological systems. We would prefer to avoid similar outcomes with his descendants. Please report to the Quantico Marine Base Medical Facility tomorrow at 0800 hours for evaluation and orientation. Failure to comply will result in immediate intervention by specialized recovery teams. This is not a request. Sarah read the message over his shoulder, her face pale. They know about you. They've probably been watching since your first visit to the clinic. Mason closed the laptop and began gathering essential supplies cache. Documents, weapons, and survival gear he'd hoped never to need again. The quiet life he'd built in Millbrook was over, replaced by the kind of running battle he'd thought he'd left behind in Iraq. "What about Dr. Chen?" Sarah asked. "Should we warn her?" "Dr. Chen was assigned to monitor my activation," Mason said. Grimly, "Harold told her to call you to the facility because he wanted you to witness his revelations. But I'm betting her real job was to report my progress to whoever sent that email." The realization that his trusted physician had been part of the program from the beginning added another layer of betrayal to Mason's situation. Everyone he trusted, every relationship he'd built, had been compromised by Project Shepherd's long reach. "Where will you go?" Mason shouldered his pack and checked his sidearm, a habit from his military days that suddenly felt relevant again. "First to warn the others, then to find Dr. Kane. If there's a way to break free from this program, she's our best hope of finding it. I'm coming with you." "Sarah, you don't understand what you're volunteering for. These people have been eliminating threats to their program for 70 years. They won't hesitate to kill anyone who gets in their way. Then I guess it's a good thing I'm going with someone who's been genetically enhanced for combat situations." Despite the gravity of their situation, Mason found himself smiling. Sarah's determination reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her, the quiet courage that emerged when someone she cared about was threatened. "All right," he said, "but we do this my way. Military tactics, constant movement, assume everyone is compromised until proven otherwise." As they prepared to leave Mason's apartment for the last time, the weight of Harold's hidden documents seemed to grow heavier. The manual represented both condemnation and hope proof of Project Shepherd's crimes against American families, but also potential clues for breaking free from its control. Outside, Millbrook continued its peaceful evening routine, unaware that one of its residents had just declared war against a program that had shaped American military policy for 7 decades. But in the small apartment above the barbershop, 2 people prepared for a battle that would determine not just their own survival, but the fate of thousands of families caught in Project Shepherd's biological web. The enemy had revealed itself at last. Now the real fight could begin. Dr. Elizabeth Kane lived in a fortress disguised as a retirement community. Mason realized this as he and Sarah approached the Potomac Valley Senior Living Center, noting the sophisticated security systems, the strategically positioned cameras, and the way the maintenance staff moved with the alert posture of trained operatives. What appeared to be a standard upscale facility for aging academics was actually a carefully protected sanctuary for people with dangerous knowledge. They had driven through the night, taking circuitous routes and switching vehicles twice precautions. That proved necessary when Sarah spotted the same black sedan following them through 3 different states. Mason's enhanced tactical awareness had kicked in during the drive, his mind automatically cataloging potential ambush points, escape routes, and defensive positions with a clarity that was both helpful and deeply unsettling. The man who met them in the facility's lobby was introduced as Dr. Kane's nephew, but his bearing and the way his jacket hung suggested military or intelligence background. He led them through corridors lined with what appeared to be distinguished elderly residents, though Mason noticed how many of them watched their passage with eyes that were anything but vacant. "Aunt Elizabeth is 91 years old," the nephew explained as they approached a corner suite. "She's maintained her mental faculties remarkably well, but she tires easily. Please keep your visit brief." Dr. Elizabeth Kane was a tiny woman with silver hair and eyes that had lost none of their scientific curiosity despite her advanced age. Her apartment was filled with books, research papers, and laboratory equipment that seemed far more sophisticated than what a retirement community should allow. "Mr. Calloway," she said, gesturing for them to sit in chairs positioned to give her a clear view of both visitors. Harold's grandson. You look like him, same stubborn jaw, same soldier's posture. I assume you're here because the modifications have begun to activate. You knew my grandfather? I knew all the test subjects. They were my responsibility, my great scientific achievement, and my greatest moral failure. Her voice carried the weight of 7 decades of guilt. Harold was one of the volunteers for the initial trials. Intelligent, brave, and completely trusting of the doctors who promised to make him a better soldier. Sarah leaned forward. Dr. Kane, we found Harold's hidden documents. The Project Shepherd manual, the medical files, evidence of genetic modifications passed down through generations. We need to understand what was done to these families and whether it can be undone. Dr. Kane studied Sarah with the intensity of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and allies quickly. You're not enhanced. Medical background, I'd guess. Nursing or general practice. I'm a nurse practitioner. I've been treating Mason and helping him understand his condition. Then you understand the complexity of what we're dealing with. The modifications aren't simply biological implants that can be surgically removed. They're integrated genetic alterations that have become part of the subject's cellular structure. Mason felt the familiar burning sensation across his back as the spiral pattern responded to stress. Harold said you tried to stop the program from within, that you developed countermeasures. I tried to develop reversal techniques, yes. But my research was classified and then terminated when I began asking uncomfortable questions about informed consent and long-term effects. I was forced out of government service in 1954, branded as unreliable and potentially traitorous. She rose slowly and moved to a bookshelf, retrieving a thick folder bound with string. But I never stopped working on the problem. For 70 years, I've been developing and refining approaches to neutralize the biological modifications. The folder contained decades of research laboratory notes, chemical formulas, biological diagrams, and most importantly, detailed protocols for what Dr. Kane called genetic deactivation therapy. The modifications work by creating new neural pathways that can be controlled externally, she explained, spreading the documents across her coffee table. But they're dependent on specific protein chains that maintain the enhanced connections. Disrupt those proteins, and the enhancements begin to break down. Sarah studied the chemical formulas with professional interest. What are the side effects of this deactivation therapy? Dr. Kane's expression grew grim, severe. The process of breaking down the enhanced neural pathways causes significant trauma to the nervous system. Subjects experience intense pain, temporary paralysis, and in some cases, permanent damage to cognitive or motor functions. And if the process fails, death. The enhanced systems are so integrated with normal biological functions that incomplete deactivation can cause complete nervous system failure. Mason absorbed this information with the detached analysis his tactical enhancements provided, weighing risks and benefits with inhuman precision. The realization that his own mind was being shaped by the modifications added urgency to his decision-making process. How many people have you tested this therapy on? 17 subjects over the past 30 years. All volunteers who had discovered their enhanced status and sought me out for help. 9 survived the deactivation process and returned to normal human baselines. 8 died during treatment. The statistics were sobering, barely better than 50% survival rate for a procedure that represented the only known escape from Project Shepherd's control. What about partial deactivation? Sarah asked. Reducing the enhancements without complete reversal? I've experimented with graduated approaches, but they're inherently unstable. The biological modifications seem designed to resist partial interference. It's either complete integration or complete removal. There's no middle ground. A soft chime from Dr. Kane's communication system interrupted their conversation. A nephew's voice came through with carefully controlled urgency. "Aunt Elizabeth, you have visitors in the lobby. Federal agents asking about recent contacts." Dr. Kane was already moving, gathering her research materials with practiced efficiency. "They've tracked you here. Not surprising, enhanced individuals emit detectable biological signatures that their monitoring systems can identify." "We need to go," Mason said, his enhanced awareness already mapping escape routes and defensive positions. "No, you need to. Take this." Dr. Kane pressed a small metal device into his hands along with several vials of clear liquid. "This is a portable deactivation unit I've been developing. It's untested, but it represents your best hope of breaking free from the virus. Programs control." Mason examined the device, about the size of a smartphone but heavier, with what appeared to be injection ports and electronic controls. "How does it work?" "The device delivers precisely calibrated doses of the deactivation compound directly to the spiral pattern on your back. The electronic components monitor your nervous system and adjust the treatment in real time to prevent fatal disruption." "And the survival rate?" Dr. Kane met his eyes with the unflinching honesty of someone who had spent decades grappling with moral complexity. "Unknown. You would be the first test subject for the automated system. But given the alternatives complete, subjugation to the program or elimination by their security teams, I believe the risk is justified." Heavy footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of their pursuers. Mason's enhanced hearing picked up the subtle sounds of coordinated movement, multiple individuals. Military precision, weapons concealed but readily accessible. "There's a service corridor behind the kitchen," Dr. Kane's nephew said, appearing in the doorway with tactical gear that confirmed Mason's suspicions about his background. "I can delay them for maybe 10 minutes. Dr. Kane gripped Mason's arm with surprising strength. "The device is programmed with everything I've learned about genetic deactivation. If you choose to use it, follow the protocols exactly. And remember, the program has been controlling enhanced bloodlines for 70 years. They won't give up their assets easily." Mason pocketed the device and vials, feeling their weight like a promise and a threat. The choice between uncertain freedom and guaranteed servitude had been reduced to a few ounces of experimental technology. "What about the others?" Sarah asked as they prepared to leave. "Tommy, Rita, Carl. They deserve the same choice. If the device works on me, I'll find ways to help them. If it doesn't," Mason didn't finish the sentence. They all understood. The implications that the escape from the retirement facility proved the effectiveness of Mason's enhanced abilities. His tactical awareness guided them through service corridors and maintenance areas with preternatural efficiency, while his improved physical capabilities allowed him to move silently and swiftly, despite carrying Sarah and the research materials. They emerged into the facility's parking area as federal vehicles surrounded the main building. Mason counted 12 agents, all moving with the coordination of a specialized unit trained for enhanced subject recovery. "They're not taking chances," he observed, leading Sarah to their backup vehicle, a motorcycle Tommy had provided that could navigate terrain and traffic patterns that would stop conventional pursuit dawn as they rode away from the facility. Mason felt the weight of Dr. Kane's device against his ribs. The old scientist had spent 70 years developing what might be the only escape from Project Shepherd's control. And now the fate of that research rested with an enhanced soldier who wasn't sure he could trust his own decision-making processes. Behind them, the retirement community receded into distance and darkness. But Mason knew their visit had set larger forces in motion. The program's handlers would realize that their most valuable research subject had accessed deactivation technology. The careful balance between covert activation and public secrecy would shift toward more aggressive intervention. Sarah's arms tightened around his waist as they navigated mountain roads at speeds that would have been suicidal for normal human reflexes. But Mason's enhanced capabilities processed the complex dynamics of high-speed travel with inhuman precision, his mind calculating angles, friction coefficients, and risk assessments faster than conscious thought. "Where are we going?" Sarah shouted over the engine noise. "To warn the others," Mason replied, his enhanced tactical awareness already plotting routes to reach Tommy, Rita, and Carl before federal recovery teams could locate them. "And then to make a choice that's going to determine whether we live as free human beings or die as failed experiments." The device in his jacket seemed to grow heavier with each mile, carrying the weight of scientific breakthrough and moral responsibility that Dr. Elizabeth Kane had borne for 7 decades. Soon, Mason would have to decide whether to trust his life to experimental technology developed by a scientist who understood the modifications better than anyone alive. But first, he had to reach his fellow enhanced individuals and give them the same impossible choice between uncertain freedom and guaranteed servitude that had defined his grandfather's generation of soldiers. The road ahead disappeared into darkness, but Mason's enhanced vision pierced the night with crystal clarity. Behind them, the forces of Project Shepherd mobilized for a hunt that would determine the future of genetic enhancement in America. The war for control of enhanced bloodlines had finally begun in earnest, and Mason Calloway found himself carrying the only weapon that might tip the balance toward freedom. The safety deposit box key had been hidden in the lining of Harold's old Army footlocker, discovered only when Mason was preparing to donate his grandfather's belongings to charity. The key was attached to a small card with an address in Richmond and a box number, along with Harold's shaky handwriting. "For Mason, when you're ready for the whole truth." Mason and Sarah drove to Richmond the next morning, both exhausted from their escape from the retirement facility, but driven by the urgency of staying ahead of federal recovery teams. The bank was a small, independent institution in an older part of the city, the kind of place that valued discretion and asked few questions about long-term clients. "Box 847, Mason told the elderly clerk, presenting the key and identification documents. It was rented by Harold Calloway. The clerk examined Harold's death certificate and Mason's military ID with professional thoroughness before leading them into the vault. Box 847 was larger than Mason had expected, more like a small filing cabinet than the typical safety deposit box. "Take your time," the clerk said, leaving them alone in the small viewing room. Mason opened the box with trembling hands, expecting to find more evidence of Project Shepherd's crimes, or perhaps Harold's personal mementos from the war. Instead, he discovered documents that shattered everything he believed about his family's involvement in the program. The first folder contained Harold's original enlistment papers, but not the standard forms Mason had expected. These were volunteer agreements for experimental medical procedures, signed with full knowledge of the risks and potential consequences. Harold hadn't been an unwilling victim of Project Shepherd. He had been an eager participant. "I don't understand," Sarah said, reading over Mason's shoulder. He knew what they were going to do to him. The documents painted a picture of willing collaboration that contradicted Harold's story of deception and betrayal. Young Harold Calloway had volunteered for biological enhancement experiments in exchange for financial compensation that would support his family for generations. The modifications weren't forced upon unwitting soldiers. They were purchased with carefully negotiated contracts. The second folder contained correspondence between Harold and Project Shepherd administrators, spanning decades. Letters discussing bloodline maintenance, activation schedules, and operational readiness assessments. Harold hadn't been hiding from the program after Korea. He had been reporting to them regularly, providing updates on his descendants and their developmental progress. Mason's hands shook as he read a letter dated just 6 months before his own military enlistment. Subject: M. Calloway shows exceptional promise for enhanced capabilities. recommend acceleration of activation protocols upon completion of conventional military training. They were tracking me my entire life, Mason whispered, planning my enhancement from birth. The third folder contained the most devastating revelation. Of all financial records showing regular payments to Harold's family account from a Defense Department subsidiary, payments that had continued through Mason's father's lifetime and into Mason's own military career. Every success, every promotion, every commendation had been purchased with blood money from Project Shepherd. But the final document in the box redefined Mason's understanding of betrayal entirely. It was a contemporary report dated just 2 weeks before Harold's death, detailing Mason's progress through the activation process. The report was signed by Dr. Sarah Chen. Sarah stepped back from the table as if the document were radioactive. Mason, I can explain. You're one of them. Mason's voice was flat, emotionless, the tone he'd used in Iraq when processing battlefield intelligence that could mean life or death for his unit. You've been monitoring me from the beginning. Yes, but not by choice. They recruited me right out of medical school, told me I was part of a vital national security program. They assigned me to Millbrook specifically to monitor your activation. Mason's enhanced analytical capabilities processed this information with inhuman precision. Every conversation, every moment of intimacy, every expression of concern had been performed by an agent of the program that had shaped his entire existence. The other enhanced individuals, Tommy, Rita, Carl, do they have handlers too? Yes. Each activated subject is assigned a monitor to track their progress and provide guidance during the enhancement process. And if we refuse to cooperate? Sarah's expression crumbled. Elimination protocols. Enhanced subjects who resist activation or pose security risks are terminated and their bodies disposed of to prevent exposure of the program. Mason felt something fundamental shift inside his mind, a cold clarity that pushed aside emotional reactions in favor of tactical analysis. The spiral pattern on his back burned with increasing intensity as his modifications responded to the psychological stress of betrayal. How many others know? About you specifically? Just your handler and his superiors. But the program has hundreds of active monitors worldwide. Enhanced bloodlines in dozens of countries, all being tracked and managed by their respective governments. My handler? Sarah reached into her purse with careful, deliberate movements, withdrawing a business card that Mason recognized with sick certainty. Colonel James Williams, U.S. Army Medical Research Command. The same signature appeared on many of the documents in Harold's collection. He's been managing your family's enhancement for 30 years, Sarah said quietly. Your father, your grandfather, and now you. He's the one who authorized your activation and assigned me to monitor your progress. Mason stared at the card, his enhanced mind connecting patterns and relationships with devastating clarity. The car accident that killed my parents, that wasn't an accident, was it? They were trying to remove you from the program. Take you somewhere the handlers couldn't find you. Colonel Williams couldn't allow that kind of security breach. The revelation that his parents had died trying to protect him from Project Shepherd added another layer of betrayal to Mason's situation. Everyone who should have protected him had instead delivered him to the program that saw him as a biological weapon rather than a human being. Why are you telling me this now? Sarah moved slowly toward the table, her hands visible and non-threatening. The behavior of someone who understood they were dealing with an enhanced individual whose psychological conditioning had been severely compromised. Because I fell in love with you. Because watching you struggle with the activation made me realize that what we're doing to enhanced individuals is monstrous. Because I want to help you break free, even if it means destroying my own career and possibly my life. Mason's tactical awareness cataloged Sarah's micro-expressions, stress indicators, and behavioral patterns with inhuman precision. His enhanced Capabilities detected no deception in her words, but also recognized that a trained intelligence operative might be skilled enough to fool even augmented perception. The deactivation device Dr. Kane gave me, does Colonel Williams know about it? Not yet, but he will soon. Federal agents raided the retirement facility 2 hours after we left. Dr. Kane was taken into custody, and all her research materials were confiscated. What about her nephew? Killed resisting arrest. The official report will cite an accidental discharge during the apprehension of a dangerous fugitive. The casual mention of murder underscored the lengths Project Shepherd would go to protect its secrets. Dr. Kane's 70 years of research into genetic deactivation have been silenced with the same efficiency the program had used to eliminate other threats over the decades. How long before they track us here? Enhanced individuals emit distinctive biological signatures that can be detected by satellite surveillance. Colonel Williams probably knows our location within a few hundred meters. Mason felt his modifications surge in response to immediate threat assessment. His enhanced hearing detected the subtle sounds of vehicles approaching the bank. His tactical awareness mapped potential escape routes and defensive positions. And his nervous system flooded with adrenaline that his modified metabolism processed with inhuman efficiency. "They're here," he said, moving toward the viewing room's single exit. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Mason, there's something else you need to know. Something that changes everything. We don't have time. The program never intended to control enhanced individuals through external manipulation. That was just the cover story to maintain operational security." Mason paused, his enhanced analytical capabilities recognizing the significance of Sarah's urgent tone. The real purpose of Project Shepherd was to create a new branch of human evolution. Enhanced bloodlines that would gradually replace normal humanity over the course of several generations. You're not being activated as a weapon, you're being activated as a breeding pair. The implications hit Mason like physical blows. The careful matching of enhanced individuals, the emphasis on preserving bloodlines, the multi-generational scope of the program. It wasn't about creating super soldiers. It was about replacing humanity itself with a genetically modified species under government control. The other enhanced individuals, Tommy, Rita, Carl, all selected for genetic compatibility with your bloodline. The group formation, the shared experiences, the emotional bonding. It was all orchestrated to create breeding pairs who would produce the next generation of enhanced offspring. Mason stared at Sarah, his modified mind processing the magnitude of the deception. Everything he had believed about his situation, about his relationships with the other enhanced individuals, about the nature of Project Shepherd itself, had been carefully constructed lies. How many generations? The planners estimated 7 to 10 generations to achieve complete replacement of baseline humanity. Enhanced individuals have longer lifespans, superior health, and enhanced reproductive capabilities. Within 2 centuries, normal humans would become a minority population. The sound of tactical teams surrounding the bank snapped Mason back to immediate concerns. His enhanced capabilities had made him a more effective soldier, but they had also made him a breeding animal in a program designed to remake the human species. The deactivation device, will it work? I don't know. Dr. Kane's research was theoretical, untested on subjects with your level of enhancement integration. Using it could kill you, disable you, or simply fail to affect the modifications at all. And if I don't use it, then you become what they designed you to be. Enhanced breeding stock for the next phase of human evolution, controlled by handlers who see you as livestock rather than a person. Mason felt the weight of the deactivation device in his jacket, the small piece of technology that represented the only potential escape from a fate worse than death. But Sarah's revelations had added new complexity to his decision. The enhanced individuals he had hoped to save might be genetically programmed to resist freedom. The others don't know, do they? About the breeding program? Their handlers haven't revealed that aspect of the mission yet. The psychological conditioning has to be complete before enhanced individuals can accept their role in species replacement. Heavy footsteps in the bank corridor announced the arrival of Colonel Williams and his recovery team. Mason's enhanced hearing detected at least 8 individuals, all armed, all moving with military precision. "Last chance," Sarah said urgently. "Use the device now, before they can stop you. It's the only way to break free from their control." Mason looked at the woman he had loved, the woman who had betrayed him, the woman who was now offering him salvation at the cost of her own life. His enhanced analytical capabilities weighed options and probabilities with inhuman precision, but the decision he faced was fundamentally human. The door to the viewing room opened, revealing a tall man in military uniform whose bearing and confidence marked him as someone accustomed to absolute authority. "Mr. Calloway," Colonel Williams said with a slight smile, "it's time to come home." Colonel James Williams looked exactly like Mason had imagined, mid-50s, silver-haired, with the bearing of a career officer who had spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, and his eyes held the kind of certainty that came from believing absolutely in the righteousness of one's mission. "Mr. Calloway," he said, stepping into the small viewing room with 2 armed escorts, "I apologize for the dramatic circumstances, but your recent activities have made discretion impossible." Mason's enhanced tactical awareness cataloged every detail of the situation: weapon positions, distances, potential cover, escape routes blocked by additional personnel in the corridor. His modifications had turned him into a living tactical computer, processing lethal scenarios with inhuman efficiency. "I know what you are," Mason said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his enhanced metabolism. "I know what you've done to my family, what you're planning to do to enhance bloodlines across the country." Colonel Williams smiled, the expression conveying paternal approval rather than concern. "You know, fragments, pieces of a larger picture, that your limited perspective can't fully comprehend. But that's about to change." He gestured to one of his escorts, who produced a tablet computer displaying what appeared to be a detailed presentation. "Dr. Chen has done excellent work monitoring your activation, but I'm afraid her emotional attachment has compromised her objectivity. It's time you understood the true scope of Project Shepherd." The first slide showed global population statistics, resource depletion projections, and climate change models that painted a picture of civilizational collapse within decades. The second slide showed enhanced human capabilities, increased intelligence, physical performance, disease resistance, and longevity that could address humanity's most pressing challenges. "The world is facing extinction-level challenges that baseline humanity cannot solve," Colonel Williams explained. "Climate change, resource depletion, overpopulation, technological displacement problems that require capabilities beyond normal human limits." Mason studied the data, his enhanced analytical abilities confirming the accuracy of the projections. Even with his modifications providing superior processing power, the implications were staggering. "Enhanced individuals represent humanity's best hope for survival," the colonel continued. "Not as soldiers or weapons, but as the next evolutionary step. Superior problem-solving capabilities, extended lifespans, enhanced physical resilience, everything needed to navigate the challenges ahead." "By replacing normal humans," Sarah interjected, her voice carrying both accusation and resignation. "By preserving human civilization in an enhanced form. The transition will take generations, allowing baseline populations to gradually decline through natural processes, while enhanced bloodlines expand to fill critical roles in society." Colonel Williams advanced the slides showing enhanced individuals in various civilian occupations, doctors developing revolutionary treatments, scientists solving energy crises, leaders negotiating complex international agreements with superhuman analytical capabilities. "Your grandfather understood this mission," he said, looking directly at Mason. "Harold volunteered not because he was naive or coerced, but because he recognized the necessity of ensuring his descendants would survive humanity's approaching crisis." Mason felt the familiar burning sensation across his back as the spiral pattern responded to psychological stress. But along with the physical discomfort came a disturbing sense of clarity. His enhanced modifications were making Colonel Williams' arguments seem more logical, more compelling than they should have been. The conditioning, he realized aloud. The modifications aren't just enhancing my capabilities. They're making me more receptive to the program's objectives. The biological modifications include psychological integration protocols. Yes. Enhanced. Individuals who fight against their nature experience constant mental and physical distress. Those who accept their role find peace, purpose, and capabilities beyond anything baseline humanity can imagine. Colonel Williams produced another device sleeker and more sophisticated than Dr. Kane's experimental deactivation unit. This is the completion protocol. It finalizes the integration process, eliminates the psychological resistance that's been causing your distress, and allows you to assume your proper role in the enhanced population. And if I refuse, then you continue to suffer until the modifications either complete integration naturally, a process that could take years and cause significant psychological damage, or your system rejects them entirely, resulting in death. Sarah stepped closer to Mason, her hand moving toward the concealed deactivation device. "There's a third option." Colonel Williams' expression hardened. "Dr. Kane's experimental technology is untested and extremely dangerous. The survival rate for genetic deactivation is less than 50%, and successful subjects suffer permanent neurological damage." "But they're free," Mason said. "They're crippled." Enhanced individuals who undergo deactivation lose not just their augmented capabilities, but portions of their baseline intelligence, physical coordination, and emotional regulation. They become less than they were before enhancement, not more. Mason felt his enhanced analytical capabilities weighing the options with inhuman precision. Accept the completion protocol and become a willing participant in humanity's replacement. Attempt deactivation and risk death or permanent disability. Do nothing and suffer a gradual psychological breakdown as his modifications completed integration without his consent. "What about the others?" he asked. "Tommy, Rhea, Carl. Do they get the same choice?" "They've already made their choice." Enhanced. Individuals who accept their nature are currently undergoing final integration at specialized facilities. Those who resist are being held in medical containment until their psychological conditioning can be completed. The revelation that his fellow enhanced individuals had been captured while he was learning the truth about Project Shepherd added urgency to Mason's decision. Whatever choice he made would have to account for their welfare as well as his own. "I want to see them," Mason demanded. "Before I make any decision about completion or deactivation, I want to confirm they're alive and being treated humanely." Colonel Williams consulted his tablet, pulling up what appeared to be medical monitoring data. "Mr. Brennan and Ms. Valdez are at the Quantico facility undergoing psychological integration therapy. Mr. Morrison is at a similar facility in Colorado, receiving treatment for enhancement rejection symptoms." The medical readouts showed vital signs and brain activity patterns that suggested the enhanced individuals were under heavy sedation or chemical restraint. Whatever psychological integration therapy involved, it appeared to require keeping subjects unconscious or semi-conscious for extended periods. "That's not treatment," Sarah said, reading the data over Mason's shoulder. "That's brainwashing. It's therapy designed to help enhanced individuals overcome their resistance to genetic destiny," Colonel Williams corrected. The process is uncomfortable, but necessary for psychological adjustment to enhanced capabilities. Mason's enhanced hearing detected sounds of additional personnel taking positions throughout the bank. His tactical awareness mapped an increasingly sophisticated containment operation designed to prevent any possibility of escape. How long do I have to decide? The completion protocol works most effectively during active enhancement integration. Waiting longer reduces the success rate and increases psychological trauma. I would recommend proceeding immediately. And the deactivation device? Colonel Williams' expression suggested he was dealing with a child who insisted on playing with dangerous toys. If you're determined to commit assisted suicide, I can't stop you. But I would strongly advise considering the implications for enhanced bloodlines worldwide. What do you mean? Your bloodline carries some of the most advanced genetic modifications in the program. Your successful completion would provide valuable data for enhancing other subjects. Your death would represent a significant loss to the entire enhanced population. Mason realized that even his death would serve Project Shepherd's purposes, providing data about the limits of genetic modification and the effectiveness of deactivation technology. There was no choice that would completely thwart the program's objectives. I need a moment alone with Sarah, he said finally. Colonel Williams nodded to his escorts, who withdrew to positions just outside the viewing room. The gesture was symbolic. Rather than practical, Mason's enhanced hearing could detect their continued presence, and surveillance equipment would monitor any conversation. What are you thinking? Sarah asked in a whisper. I'm thinking that 70 years of genetic modification and psychological conditioning have made it impossible to know whether my thoughts are my own or programmed responses, Mason replied. His enhanced analytical capabilities processing the recursive complexity of his situation. The device might not work, or it might kill you, or it might leave you brain damaged. But it might also free me from a program designed to replace humanity with genetically controlled livestock. Sarah's hand found his, her touch warm and familiar despite the betrayal that had redefined their relationship. I love you, Mason. Not the enhanced version, not the potential breeding asset you. The man who chose to come back from 3 wars, who built a quiet life in a small town, who refused to let violence define him. Even knowing that our entire relationship was orchestrated by the program, especially because of that, you made me fall in love with you. Despite my orders, despite my training, despite everything I was told about maintaining professional distance from subjects. That's not genetic modification talking. That's human connection overriding institutional control. Mason felt the weight of Dr. Kane's device in his jacket, the small piece of experimental technology that represented the only potential escape from predetermined genetic destiny. But Sarah's words reminded him that the choice wasn't just about his own freedom. It was about preserving the possibility of authentic human relationships in a world being systematically redesigned by genetic engineers. Colonel Williams cleared his throat from the doorway. Mr. Calloway, I need your decision. My superiors are monitoring this situation closely, and delayed resolution reflects poorly on the program's efficiency. Mason looked at Sarah, seeing in her eyes the same mixture of fear and determination that he'd observed in soldiers facing impossible odds. Whatever choice he made, she would share the consequences. I have conditions, Mason said, turning to face Colonel Williams. I'm listening. If I agree to the completion protocol, I want guarantees about the treatment of other enhanced individuals. No more forced integration therapy. No more medical containment. Enhanced subjects who accept their nature should be allowed to maintain their civilian identities and relationships. That's already our policy for compliant subjects. And if I choose deactivation, I want Sarah protected from retaliation. She was following orders as a program asset. Her emotional involvement was an unintended consequence, not a security breach. Colonel Williams' expression suggested mild amusement. Dr. Chen's fate depends on her future usefulness to the program. Emotional compromise can be treated with appropriate therapy. The implication that Sarah would undergo the same psychological conditioning as the enhanced individuals added another layer of stakes to Mason's decision. Every choice carried consequences for people beyond himself. Mason reached into his jacket and felt the smooth surface of Dr. Kane's device. Its weight somehow heavier than when he'd first received it. 70 years of scientific research, decades of moral struggle, and the desperate hope of an old woman who had spent her life trying to undo her greatest achievement, all condensed into a few ounces of experimental technology. "I've made my decision," he said. Mason pulled Dr. Kane's device from his jacket with deliberate slowness, watching as Colonel Williams' confident expression shifted to sharp concern. The small metallic unit seemed insignificant compared to the sophisticated completion protocol the Colonel carried, but Mason's enhanced analytical capabilities recognized the elegant complexity of its design. "Mr. Calloway, I strongly advise against 70 years. Mason interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made peace with a difficult decision. 70 years of my family serving as experimental subjects for a program designed to replace humanity. My grandfather, my father, me, all of us shaped and controlled from birth to serve someone else's vision of genetic destiny." Sarah stepped closer, her presence both comforting and heartbreaking. Mason knew that using the deactivation device would likely end their relationship, either through his death or through the neurological damage Colonel Williams had described. But it would also free him from the uncertainty of whether his feelings were genuine or programmed responses. "The device is untested," Colonel Williams said urgently. "Dr. Kane's theoretical models couldn't account for your level of enhancement, integration. You could suffer permanent paralysis, cognitive impairment, or death." "Better than living as a genetically controlled breeding animal," Mason replied, examining the device's controls. Dr. Kane had designed it for intuitive Operation 3. Injection ports that would deliver the deactivation compound directly to the spiral pattern, electronic monitoring systems to prevent fatal nervous system disruption, and an emergency stop function that could halt the process if complications arose. Mason began removing his jacket and shirt, revealing the spiral pattern that had burned with increasing intensity since his confrontation with Colonel Williams. The raised nodules seemed to pulse with their own energy, responding to his elevated stress levels and the proximity of other enhanced individuals. "There's something you need to understand," Sarah said quietly, her medical training overriding emotional concerns. "The device works by disrupting the protein chains that maintain enhanced neural pathways. The process will be extremely painful, possibly the most intense physical trauma you've ever experienced. I've been shot, blown up, and spent 18 months in military hospitals. I can handle pain. Not like this." The deactivation compound essentially dissolves the biological interface between your modifications and your nervous system. Dr. Kane's test subjects described it as having their spine dissolved with acid while remaining fully conscious. Mason paused in his preparation, his enhanced analytical capabilities processing this information with disturbing clarity. The tactical part of his mind, the part shaped by genetic modification, advised accepting Colonel Williams' completion protocol. The emotional part, the part he hoped was still genuinely human, demanded freedom regardless of cost. "How long does the process take?" "Anywhere from 30 minutes to 6 hours, depending on the level of integration and individual physiology. The monitoring system should prevent fatal complications, but Dr. Kane couldn't guarantee that subjects would remain conscious throughout the procedure." Colonel Williams had been consulting his tablet during this exchange, his expression growing increasingly urgent. "Mr. Calloway, I'm receiving instructions from my superiors regarding your situation. If you proceed with deactivation, the program will have no choice but to classify you as a security threat." "Meaning?" meaning your survival becomes a liability to national security. Enhanced subjects who successfully resist genetic destiny present unacceptable risks to program integrity. The threat was clear: use the device and become a target for elimination, regardless of whether the deactivation succeeded. Mason's enhanced tactical awareness immediately began mapping defensive strategies and escape routes. But the sophistication of the containment operation made successful resistance unlikely. What about failed deactivation attempts? Sarah asked. What happens to subjects who survive the process but retain their modifications? They become case studies for improving future deactivation countermeasures. The program learns from every attempt to resist genetic destiny, making subsequent modifications more resilient to interference. Mason realized that even failure would serve Project Shepherd's purposes, providing data to protect other enhanced individuals from similar escape attempts. But success would prove that genetic modification could be reversed, potentially inspiring resistance movements among enhanced populations worldwide. The other enhanced individuals you mentioned, the ones at Quantico and Colorado, what happens to them if I succeed? Colonel Williams' expression suggested he was dealing with a naive child. If deactivation prove viable, they will be relocated to more secure facilities, and their modifications will be upgraded to prevent similar attempts. The program has invested too much in enhanced bloodlines to risk losing valuable assets to experimental technology. The revelation of Mason's choice could make life worse for Tommy, Rita, and Carl added another layer of moral complexity to his decision. But his enhanced analytical capabilities recognized the logical fallacy in Colonel Williams' argument. The program would upgrade their modifications regardless, using his attempt as justification for more invasive procedures. How many enhanced individuals are there worldwide? Mason asked, playing for time while he considered his options. Current active subjects number approximately 40,000, with another 120,000 carrying dormant modifications awaiting activation. The program operates in 17 countries under various national security frameworks. The scale was staggering: nearly 200,000 people whose genetic destiny had been predetermined by government programs. Mason's individual choice suddenly seemed insignificant against such massive institutional momentum. And baseline humanity will be preserved in designated population reserves, maintained at sustainable levels to provide genetic diversity and cultural continuity. The transition to enhanced dominance will be gradual and humane. Sarah made a sound of disgust. You're talking about turning normal humans into an endangered species managed by genetically modified overseers. I'm talking about ensuring human survival in an enhanced form capable of addressing existential challenges. Baseline humanity lacks the cognitive and physical capabilities needed for long-term species survival. Mason's enhanced hearing detected the approach of additional personnel. The containment operation was expanding, either in preparation for his completion or his elimination. Colonel Williams was clearly receiving real-time instructions from superiors who had anticipated this scenario. My time's up, Mason said, positioning the deactivation device against his back. The injection ports aligned with the spiral pattern with disturbing precision, as if Dr. Kane had designed a unit specifically for his modifications. Mason, wait, Sarah said urgently. There's something else. The device isn't just experimental, it's incomplete. Dr. Kane was working on a two-stage process when the federal agents raided her facility. This unit only contains the first stage. Compounds. What does that mean? It means the device will begin genetic deactivation, but won't complete the process. You'll be left in a transitional state, partially enhanced but psychologically unstable, physically compromised, and vulnerable to reactivation by program handlers. Mason stared at the device, his enhanced analytical capabilities processing this new information. An incomplete deactivation would leave him worse off than before, neither fully enhanced nor completely human, but trapped in a biological limbo that served no one's purposes. Colonel Williams stepped forward, his expression mixing sympathy with professional urgency. "Mr. Calloway, please reconsider. The completion protocol will eliminate your psychological resistance while preserving your enhanced capabilities. You'll find peace with your genetic destiny and purpose in serving humanity's future." Whose humanity? The enhanced population you're creating, or the baseline humans you plan to manage like livestock? Enhanced individuals are still human, improved human, evolved human, but fundamentally human. The genetic modifications preserve everything essential about human nature while adding capabilities needed for species survival. Mason's enhanced hearing picked up radio communications from the tactical teams surrounding the bank. Snipers were taking positions, containment vehicles were blocking potential escape routes, and medical teams were standing by for either completion or deactivation scenarios. If I use this device and survive, what happens to Sarah? Dr. Chen will receive appropriate treatment for her, emotional compromise and reassignment to a position where her skills can serve the program effectively. Her cooperation in this matter will be noted favorably in her record. And if I don't survive? Colonel Williams consulted his tablet. Dr. Chen's continued usefulness to the program would be questionable. Enhanced subject handlers who lose their assets typically require extensive retraining or alternative placement. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the threat. Sarah's life depended on Mason's compliance or his death. Her survival was tied to the program's objectives, either through successful completion or elimination of a security risk. Mason felt the weight of decisions that would affect not just his own fate, but the lives of everyone he cared about. The deactivation device offered uncertain freedom at terrible cost, while Colonel Williams' completion protocol promised peace through surrender to genetic destiny. But Harold's final letter had contained one phrase that echoed in Mason's enhanced memory: "Choose differently than I did." "I'm sorry," Mason said to Sarah, his enhanced analytical capabilities calculating injection angles and pressure requirements with inhuman precision. "For everything, the deception, the betrayal, the impossible situation we've been placed in. But I can't live as someone else's genetic experiment." He pressed the device against his back and activated the first injection port. The pain hit Mason like a lightning strike, spreading outward from the spiral pattern in waves that made his vision white out and his enhanced nervous system scream in protest. Dr. Kane's deactivation compound felt like liquid fire injecting directly into his spine, dissolving the biological interfaces that had shaped his consciousness for months. "Medical team now," Colonel Williams shouted, his professional composure finally cracking as Mason collapsed to his knees. Sarah knelt beside Mason, her medical training overriding personal emotions as she monitored his vital signs. His pulse was racing beyond normal human parameters. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and the spiral pattern on his back was changing color from angry red to a sickly purple-black. "The modifications are fighting the compound," she reported, her voice clinically detached despite the tears streaming down her face. "His nervous system is in shock, but still functional." Mason's enhanced hearing picked up radio communications from the tactical teams. "Subject is down. Medical intervention in progress. Maintain containment perimeter." His enhanced vision could see heat signatures through the building's walls, mapping the positions of snipers and support personnel with crystal clarity, even as pain tore through his consciousness. The device activated the second injection port, automatically delivering another wave of deactivation compound that sent Mason into convulsions. His enhanced analytical capabilities began shutting down in sections. First, the tactical awareness that had made him a superior soldier. Then the threat assessment systems that had kept him alive through 3 combat tours. "It's working," Sarah whispered, watching as the raised nodules beneath Mason's skin began to flatten and dissolve. The biological interfaces are breaking down. But Colonel Williams was reading data from his own monitoring equipment with growing concern. The genetic deactivation is proceeding too rapidly. His enhanced metabolism is processing the compound faster than Dr. Kane's models predicted. Mason felt pieces of his enhanced consciousness disappearing like lights going out in a vast building. The superhuman strength that had made him feel invincible. The analytical precision that had turned him into a living tactical computer. The enhanced perception that had revealed hidden patterns in everything he observed. All of it dissolving under the deactivation compound's assault on his modified biology. Third injection in 60 seconds. The device announced in Dr. Kane's recorded voice. Subject vital signs within acceptable parameters. Deactivation proceeding normally. Normally? Colonel Williams stared at his monitoring equipment in disbelief. The subject should be unconscious or dead by now. No test subject has remained aware during complete genetic deactivation. Mason raised his head with tremendous effort, his vision clearing enough to focus on Colonel Williams' face. When he spoke, his voice was rough but steady. Maybe that's because I'm choosing this instead of having it forced on me. The third injection port activated, delivering the final dose of deactivation compound directly into the spiral pattern's central core. This time, the pain transcended physical sensation. Mason felt his enhanced consciousness fragmenting, the genetic modifications that had defined his recent existence dissolving at the molecular level. But something unexpected happened as the deactivation process reached completion. Instead of the neurological collapse Colonel Williams had predicted, Mason felt a profound sense of clarity, not the artificial precision of enhanced analytics, but the authentic awareness of a mind, finally, free from biological programming. Impossible, Colonel Williams muttered, reading data that contradicted everything he understood about genetic modification. The subject is achieving complete deactivation without significant neurological damage. Sarah checked Mason's pulse and breathing, her medical training helping her process what she was observing. His vital signs are stabilizing, blood pressure normalizing, heart rate dropping to baseline human parameters. The spiral pattern is completely flat, no trace of the embedded nodules. Mason slowly pushed himself to his feet, his movements careful but controlled. The superhuman strength was gone, the enhanced reflexes had vanished, and the tactical awareness that had turned him into a living weapon was just a fading memory. But he was still himself, perhaps more himself than he'd been since the activation began. "How do you feel?" Sarah asked, her voice mixing professional concern with personal relief. "Human," Mason replied, the word carrying more weight than he'd ever given it before. "Just human." Colonel Williams stepped forward, his expression mixing frustration with scientific curiosity. "Mr. Calloway, you've just undergone a procedure that should have killed you or left you permanently disabled. The fact that you're conscious and coherent suggests that Dr. Kane's research was more advanced than we realized, or that you never understood what you were doing to people in the first place. The genetic modifications were designed to be permanent and irreversible. The fact that they can be successfully deactivated creates significant complications for program security." Mason looked at Colonel Williams with eyes that no longer possessed enhanced perception, but saw more clearly than they had in months. "The program finished, Colonel. You've just witnessed proof that genetic destiny isn't inevitable. Enhanced individuals can choose to be human instead of living weapons. One successful deactivation doesn't invalidate 70 years of genetic research. And even if the process can be replicated, most enhanced individuals won't have access to Dr. Kane's technology. Then I'll make sure they do." The simple statement carried an implication that made Colonel Williams reach for his sidearm. "Mr. Calloway, you are now in possession of classified information about a vital national security program. Your cooperation or your silence is no longer optional." Sarah moved protectively between Mason and the colonel, her own decision crystallizing as she watched the man she loved reclaim his humanity. He's not the only one with classified information. I've been documenting the program's activities for months: medical procedures, psychological manipulation, elimination of resistant subjects. Everything needed to expose Project Shepherd to congressional oversight. Dr. Chen, you are an employee of this program. Your documentation was conducted under official auspices for legitimate research purposes. My documentation includes evidence of murders, illegal human experimentation, and genetic modification without informed consent. I don't think congressional investigators will accept national security as justification for crimes against humanity. Mason felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with enhanced genetics. Sarah was choosing to risk everything for the possibility of exposing Project Shepherd's decades of abuse. Her courage was entirely human, unmodified by genetic programming or biological compulsion. The enhanced individuals at Quantico and Colorado, Mason said. I want them released and given the same choice I had: completion or deactivation with full knowledge of the consequences. Colonel Williams' expression suggested he was dealing with demands from someone who had no leverage to enforce them. Enhanced subjects under medical care cannot be released to unauthorized personnel. Their safety and the program's security require continued supervision. Their imprisonment requires congressional authorization and judicial oversight. Unless you're planning to classify them as enemy combatants, they have constitutional rights that supersede program objectives. The standoff continued for several tense moments, with Colonel Williams clearly receiving instructions through his earpiece, while Sarah and Mason waited to learn whether they would be allowed to leave or eliminated as security threats. Finally, Colonel Williams holstered his weapon and stepped back. Mr. Calloway, Dr. Chen, you are free to leave. However, your activities will be monitored closely, and any attempt to publicize classified information will result in immediate intervention under national security provisions. And the other enhanced individuals will be offered the same choice. You receive completion or medical discharge from the program. Those who choose deactivation will receive appropriate medical support and counseling to help them adjust to baseline human capabilities. Mason knew the colonel's promises were worth little. Project Shepherd had been eliminating inconvenient people for decades, but his successful deactivation had created complications the program couldn't easily resolve. If the process could be replicated, enhanced bloodlines worldwide might choose freedom over genetic destiny. We'll be in touch, Mason said, helping Sarah gather the scattered documents from Harold's safety deposit box. The evidence of Project Shepherd's scope and methods would be crucial for any future exposure efforts. As they prepared to leave the bank, Colonel Williams made one final attempt to salvage his mission. Mr. Calloway, you should understand that genetic deactivation doesn't guarantee safety from program oversight. Enhanced bloodlines carry valuable genetic material regardless of their individual activation status. Your children, should you have any, would still be of interest to genetic researchers. Mason turned back to face the colonel, his expression carrying the quiet determination of someone who had chosen his path. Then you'd better hope I never have children, Colonel, because I'll spend the rest of my life making sure they never become anyone's genetic experiments. The threat was delivered. Without enhanced analytical capabilities or superhuman physical presence, just human resolve backed by moral clarity. But Colonel Williams understood that Mason Calloway had just become a more dangerous enemy to Project Shepherd than any enhanced soldier could have been. As they walked out of the bank into the afternoon sunlight, Mason felt the absence of his modifications, like phantom pain capabilities he'd grown accustomed to, suddenly gone. But along with the loss came something more valuable: the certainty that his thoughts, feelings, and choices were authentically his own. What happens now? Sarah asked, her hand finding his as they walked toward their vehicle. Now we find the others and give them the same choice I had. And then we figure out how to expose a 70-year conspiracy without getting killed in the process. Mason looked back at the bank where he'd faced the most important decision of his life, then forward to an uncertain future that was entirely his own to determine. The spiral pattern on his back was gone, dissolved by Dr. Kane's experimental compound, but the memory of what it had represented would drive his actions for the rest of his life. Project Shepherd had created him to be the perfect soldier in their vision of enhanced humanity. Instead, they had forged the perfect enemy, someone who understood their methods intimately and possessed the moral clarity to oppose them with every fiber of his reclaimed humanity. 6 months later, Mason Calloway stood in the same Blue Ridge Mountains cabin where he'd first met the other enhanced individuals. But the gathering this time was different. Instead of 4 confused people trying to understand their condition, the room now held representatives from enhanced bloodlines across 3 continents, men and women who had chosen freedom over genetic destiny. The Shepherd Children Network, as they'd come to call themselves, had grown beyond Mason's most optimistic projections. What had started as desperate communication between isolated individuals had evolved into a sophisticated support system for enhanced people seeking deactivation or resistance to program control. Tommy Brennan had been the first to join Mason after his successful deactivation. The Emmett had endured 3 weeks of psychological integration therapy at Quantico before Sarah's leaked documentation prompted congressional inquiries that forced his release. His deactivation had been more difficult than Mason's complications. That left him with occasional tremors and memory gaps, but he retained his essential humanity and his commitment to helping others escape the program. Rita Valdez had chosen a different path. The educator had accepted her enhanced analytical capabilities but rejected program control, using her abilities to identify and protect other enhanced individuals while maintaining her civilian identity. Her position in the education system provided cover for contacting families with enhanced children before program handlers could claim them. Carl Morrison had surprised everyone by choosing to keep his physical enhancements while severing psychological ties to Project Shepherd. His construction background proved invaluable for establishing secure communication networks and safe houses for enhanced individuals seeking freedom from program control. The cabin's main room now served as a strategic planning center with maps showing enhanced population distributions, communication equipment linking them to sympathetic congressional investigators, and medical supplies for supporting deactivation procedures. Dr. Sarah Chen had become their primary medical coordinator, adapting Dr. Kane's research to create safer, more reliable deactivation protocols. The latest intelligence suggests the program is scaling back active recruitment, reported Maria Santos, a former enhanced operative from Spain who had escaped European program control. Congressional oversight has made large-scale activation too risky, but they're focusing on protecting existing assets. Mason reviewed the global status report with the analytical skills he developed as a soldier, not enhanced capabilities, but hard-earned human experience applied to protecting people he'd come to consider family. The Shepherd Children Network now included members from 17 countries, with active resistance cells in major population centers worldwide. What about the facilities? Asked David Kim, whose father had been part of the Korean War experiments alongside Harold Calloway. Are they still holding enhanced individuals against their will? 3 facilities in the U.S. have been closed due to congressional pressure, Sarah reported from her medical files. But we believe they've relocated operations to private contractors and overseas installations. The program is adapting rather than surrendering. Mason wasn't surprised. 70 years of institutional momentum couldn't be stopped by congressional hearings or media exposure. Project Shepherd had survived multiple political administrations, budget crises, and ethical investigations. But the successful development of deactivation technology had created vulnerabilities the program couldn't easily address. The key is choice, Mason said, addressing the group with the authority of someone who had lived through the programs. Worse manipulations. Enhanced individuals who know they can break free are less likely to accept program control. Every successful deactivation proves that genetic destiny isn't inevitable. The statistics supported his assessment. Of the 847 enhanced individuals who had contacted the network, 312 had chosen deactivation. 89 had elected to keep their abilities while rejecting program control, and 446 remained undecided but were no longer isolated. The program's ability to control enhanced populations through secrecy and manipulation had been permanently compromised. "We've received a communication from Colonel Williams," Sarah announced, producing a secure tablet that displayed an encrypted message. "He wants to negotiate." The message was brief and formal. The program acknowledges the effectiveness of deactivation technology and the impossibility of maintaining previous operational security. "We propose a negotiated settlement that addresses the concerns of enhanced individuals while preserving vital national security interests." "It's a trap," Tommy said immediately, his experience with program manipulation making him deeply suspicious of any official overture. "Probably," Mason agreed. "But it's also an admission that we've damaged their capabilities enough to force negotiation." "That's progress." Rita studied the message with her enhanced analytical abilities, looking for patterns and implications that might not be obvious to baseline human perception. The language suggests they're prepared to make significant concessions in exchange for network cooperation. They're more concerned about exposure than resistance. "Which means our documentation efforts are working," Sarah noted with satisfaction. "The threat of public revelation is more effective than direct confrontation." Mason walked to the cabin's window, looking out at the peaceful Virginia mountains, where his grandfather had once hidden from the very program that now sought accommodation with its former victims. The irony wasn't lost on him. Harold had spent decades in fearful silence, while Mason had chosen open resistance that was forcing institutional change. "Here's what we're going to do," he announced, turning back to face the group. "We'll meet with Colonel Williams, but on our terms and with full transparency. Every enhanced individual deserves to know that deactivation is possible and that they have choices beyond program control." Over the following weeks, the Shepherd Children Network prepared for negotiations that would determine the future of enhanced populations worldwide. Mason found himself in the strange position of representing people he'd never met against a program that had shaped his family for 3 generations. The meeting took place in a congressional hearing room, with representatives from multiple oversight committees providing official witness to any agreements reached. Colonel Williams looked older than Mason remembered, his confidence replaced by the weary resignation of someone whose life's work had been fundamentally challenged. "The program is prepared to offer enhanced individuals voluntary participation in genetic research with full informed consent," Colonel Williams began, reading from prepared remarks. "Deactivation technology will be made available to any enhanced subject who chooses to return to baseline human parameters." "And the children?" Mason asked, thinking of the enhanced bloodlines that would carry genetic modifications into future generations. "What happens to enhanced families who want their children to have normal lives?" "Genetic screening and modification programs will become voluntary rather than mandatory. Enhanced parents will have the right to choose whether their children receive activation protocols." It wasn't everything Mason had hoped for, but it represented a fundamental shift from genetic destiny to personal choice. The program would continue in some form, too much institutional investment and genuine national security concerns to simply disappear, but enhanced individuals would no longer be treated as biological property. "We want monitoring and enforcement," Sarah demanded. "Independent oversight of all enhancement activities." with regular inspections of facilities and mandatory reporting of enhanced individual status. Congressional oversight is already established. Additional monitoring can be negotiated as part of the settlement agreement. The negotiations continued for 3 days, with lawyers, congressmen, and advocates working to construct a framework that protected enhanced individuals while addressing legitimate security concerns. Mason found the process simultaneously exhausting and hopeful proof that institutional change was possible when people refused to accept predetermined roles. The final agreement wasn't perfect, but it established principles that would protect future generations from the kind of genetic manipulation that had defined Mason's family. Enhanced individuals would have legal rights, informed consent requirements, and access to deactivation technology. The program would continue, but as a voluntary research initiative rather than a coercive population control system. 6 months after the agreement was signed, Mason stood in the cemetery where Harold was buried, carrying flowers and a copy of the legislation that had codified enhanced individual rights. The old soldier's gravestone was simple name, dates, military service, with no mention of the decades he'd spent carrying genetic secrets. "We did it, Grandpa," Mason said quietly, placing the flowers beside the headstone. "Maybe not the way you would have chosen, but we broke the cycle. Enhanced families get to choose their own futures now." Sarah joined him at the gravesite, her hand finding his in the comfortable intimacy they'd rebuilt after the revelations about her initial role in his life. Their relationship had required complete honesty and rebuilt trust, but it had emerged stronger for having survived the program's manipulations. "Any regrets?" she asked, knowing that Mason still sometimes missed the enhanced capabilities that had been part of him for those intense months. "About the deactivation?" "Never. About not finding this solution sooner? Every day." Mason looked out over the peaceful Virginia countryside, thinking about the enhanced individuals worldwide who were now free to choose their own paths. The Shepherd Children Network continued to operate, providing support and information to enhanced families, but its mission had evolved from resistance to advocacy. Project Shepherd would continue in some form. The legitimate research applications were too valuable to abandon completely, but it would no longer treat enhanced individuals as genetic property. The spiral patterns that had marked Mason and his fellow enhanced subjects had become symbols of choice rather than predetermined. Destiny dawned as they walked back toward their car. Mason felt the absence of his enhanced capabilities as a reminder of the choice he'd made. He was slower than he'd been with genetic modifications, less analytically precise, more vulnerable to threats he would have easily detected and countered. But he was also authentically himself human in the fullest sense, with all the limitations and possibilities that entailed. The quiet life he'd built in Millbrook was gone, replaced by a more complex existence that included speaking engagements, congressional testimony, and coordination of enhanced individual support networks. But it was a life he'd chosen rather than one determined by genetic programming, and that made all the difference. Mason Calloway had been designed to be the perfect soldier in a war to replace humanity with genetically controlled populations. Instead, he had become the perfect advocate for human choice, someone who understood enhancement intimately but valued authentic humanity even more. The Shepherd children had found their way home.